what is required in the sixth commandment. The sixth commandment requireth all lawful endeavors to preserve our own life and the life of others.
In question 68, we move on to what is required in the sixth commandment. And here we see stated explicitly what we noted in the previous class, namely that the moral principle captured in this particular commandment is the lawful preservation of innocent life. The lawful preservation of innocent life. Now, it doesn't explicitly say just human life, so that's interesting. What would that entail? So, for example, the question of animals. What do we do with animals? And it's interesting here because the Bible gives us plenty of instruction and guidance on this question. On the one hand, the book of Proverbs tells us that even that a righteous man will care for his beasts, for the animals that he owns. So we have resources that the Lord has given to us, which include at times pets in our house or livestock or what have you. And the righteous man has an obligation to preserve these resources. These animals don't have souls, so they're by no means at the same level as a person, but that doesn't mean that we're without any responsibility. You know, a lazy person may say, well, you know, I don't feel like feeding my dog, or I don't feel like providing the shelter that's needed in 20 below zero weather and snow and so on, and that's actually an ungodly attitude. However, it's not as if we have the unqualified preservation of animals, because the fact is that animals are given by God to help preserve human life. And we see this in a lot of different places. One interesting example would be in the time of the deluge, the time of the great flood, where Noah is called upon to build an ark, and the Lord brings 2 by 2, male and female, each kind of animal to be gathered into the ark. But you'll note that he brings 7 of the clean animals. So under the Old Testament ceremonial administration, the Israelites were restricted to only eating clean food, animals that the Lord had set apart as clean or holy. And this was for the time of the Old Testament. We noted the relationship of the ceremonial law, which is not binding in the New Testament, but the Lord had his purposes, which we've explained previously with regard to this. Well, the reason that there are a greater proportion of clean animals that are taken into the ark, one, is because they would be used for sacrifices, and you can think as they come out of the ark and they begin to look at the prospects of repopulating the earth with these animals and so on, Noah offers a sacrifice shortly after coming out of the ark. Think of the level of sacrifice that was for him. It's not as if he had, copious amounts of livestock to draw on. He's actually taking what few there are, one of those, in order to offer it to the Lord. And so we can see there that the beasts are being used as a means of devotion to God, and he had appointed a sacrificial system in which he required animals to be slain in his worship, that they served as a picture of the great sacrifice of Christ, who would come to atone for the sins of his people and to appease the wrath of God and to provide forgiveness of sins for us. But there's another reason as well. These were the animals that Noah would be consuming, would be killing in order to eat them. And so the Lord was actually providing for the preservation of Noah's life and that of his family by a greater number of clean animals from which they would draw upon to slaughter and to process and then to use for their food. And so animals have been given in part to help the preservation of human life, both in terms of a food source, a lawful food source that we're to consume to get protein and nourishment. Also, not just the meat, but the skins would be used. And so the skins would be used for clothing. Christ, after the fall, took and clothed Adam and Eve in the skins of animals. So we derive fur from the animals, which helps preserve our life, and leather, which is used in clothing, and so on. So animals help to preserve human life. And therefore, the killing or slaughtering of animals is indeed a lawful purpose toward that end. And so you can think, for example, here in South Carolina and many other places in the United States, hunting is a part of many people's lives, and there's a purpose. They're going out to shoot a deer, not merely for sport, though there's sport that's involved in it, but then that animal is processed and the meat is put into the freezer and it's used to sustain and strengthen the life of those who have sought it, who have gone hunting for it. That would be very different, for example, from just the indiscriminate killing of life for no good reason, right? There's a difference there, and I'm merely trying to highlight the fact that animals and the death of animals are actually given for the help of preserving human life. Another category, which we mentioned last time, would be things like exercise and food and rest. Now, one of the key points here is in moderation. So this is a more general principle that we find throughout the Bible, and it certainly comes from this commandment among others. So exercise is appropriate in moderation. It's used to give energy and strength to the body. But if all you did was exercise at the expense of work, then that would be a problem. It would be immoderate. Food is wonderful, but if you gorge yourself and engage in habitual gluttony day after day, that would be an immoderate use of food, and it actually results not in the preservation of life, but in the diminishing of life, right? So gluttony, the habitual consumption of excessive amounts of food, results in the loss of life. The same thing with rest. Now, at least in the West, and in America in particular, we're probably swinging to the end of too little rest, right? We're driven, and the time given to sleep can be reduced inordinately. And that's actually to our detriment. So not receiving adequate sleep can be a form of diminishing life. At the same time, the Bible certainly forbids the idea of excessive or immoderate sleep. And so the Proverbs, for example, are full of this, but it's found many other places in both the Old and the New Testament, those who are giving themselves too much sleep, laziness. So they lie in bed and they sleep way more than is necessary for the strength and health of the body. So it has to be in moderation. It also speaks to the idea of, against the idea of reckless behavior. Reckless behavior. So we have to be careful here. There are some activities, even recreations, which violate this principle. So if people for fun are doing things that seriously risk the loss of life, there needs to be some careful analysis and questions about this. So for pure pleasure, purely recreation, not necessity, people are engaging in reckless behavior. So they're putting themselves needlessly into the threat of death or serious bodily harm. It's a problem. You know, I've often wondered, and this is an aside, but some of the climbing expeditions that people engage in, so there's no necessity for this, and the percentage of those who lose their life in some of these expeditions is disproportionately high. Is that appropriate for the Christian? And I think not. I think that it can cross the line of this sort of reckless behavior. Now, on the other hand, there are times when it is necessity. We jump in front of a bus in order to save a child, or we risk a great deal. You know, missionaries will go into disease-ridden places or places where there are cannibals and all sorts of things. There's a purpose there that's lawful. We're taking the gospel to people who need it, and even at the risk of our life, we willingly undertake that. That would be perfectly lawful and commendable. You know, we're losing our life for Christ's sake in order that we might save it. So you can see the difference here. Both might be considered reckless in terms of the actions themselves, but one is without purpose and necessity, and the other is with purpose and necessity. We spoke last time about the role that the state has in these things. So, for example, the Bible requires capital punishment, and you'll see this as early as Genesis 9, where the Lord says, you know, if someone takes another person's life, murder, that their life is to be taken. So this is way before the coming of Mosaic law and so on. Why? Well, Genesis 9:6 says, because man is the image of God, and it is an attack on the image of God, this murderous action. And so in the case of capital punishment, we're asking the question, whose life is to be preserved? And a person who's committed unlawful murder, they have forfeited the right to their life, and God's wrath is to be visited upon them as a consequence. Well, whose life is being preserved then? The answer is the community's life. And so the community as a whole, their lives are being preserved by the removal of such a murderer. The Bible speaks about blood, the innocent blood that cries out from the ground. Another arena in which this can be taken is the individual. And here we have the idea of self-defense. And we could speak at great length about this, but it is appropriate for us to defend ourselves against unjust violence. If you go and look at the larger Catechism, this is spelled out in even greater detail. But the sixth commandment actually requires us to defend ourselves and others against unjust violence. And so in scenarios where someone is trying to take the life of ourselves or others, and we engage in pacifism, it would be wrong for us to do that. We're actually breaking the sixth commandment. We're not preserving the life of others. We have a moral obligation to defend those who are innocent. And this is seen throughout the Bible. This basic principle in the sixth commandment is seen throughout the Bible. And even if it puts ourselves in harm's way, we are to do what we are able with the tools that God has given to us to seek to help other people. Another thing I'll just add under the matter of the state is the question of just war. And this is a bigger point than we can actually cover just now. Our time is too limited. But going back to Augustine and then through the Reformation and down to the present in terms of Reformed doctrine, there is this idea of just war theory. And you basically take this principle of self-defense. It's appropriate for us to defend ourselves against unjust violence, and that applies not only personally but corporately. So just war, among other things, is defined by having a defensive posture. So then, just as an individual is required to defend themselves against unjust violence, a nation as a whole is to defend themselves against unjust violence. And so, underlying the idea of a just war is primarily this defensive posture. So the idea of nation building and empire expansion and all sorts of other things could be easily shown to be prohibited, whereas wars that are fought in defense of an intruder and of those who are seeking to destroy the nation would be just. And that's something that's bigger, as I said, than we have time to cover here, but at least gives you a pointer with regards to how all of these things tie together. In question 68, what is required in the sixth commandment? The sixth commandment requireth all lawful endeavors to preserve our own life and the life of others.